Good day, everyone. So this is your professor. I am Miss Rizame Arguera, and for today's discussion, we will be dealing with the shift of educational focus from content to learning outcomes. Before we proceed, let us define educational focus first. So the aim of it is to help people become better citizens that shows the difference between good and bad. Basically, educative process happens between the teacher and the student. But before we go further, here are the expected learning outcomes of our topic. So may I read to you first? Firstly, you are all expected to distinguish among institutional outcomes, program outcomes, course outcomes, and learning outcomes. Secondly, distinguish between immediate outcomes and deferred outcomes. Thirdly, to differentiate educational objectives from learning outcomes. And lastly, formulate learning outcomes based on given educational objectives. Ironically, we were adhered to the idea that education is a pouring in process where the teacher was the infallible giver of knowledge and the student was the passive recipient. We also regarded that the very focus of instruction was purely content and subject matter. In a simpler manner, when someone finishes a certain course, we assumingly and immediately call or pronounce the student educated. Fortunately, with the advent of technology, the perspective in education was changed. This change is called OBE. What is OBE? So OBE means outcome-based education. Now, the question is, why outcome-based education? So outcome-based education because it is a flexible, empowerment-oriented approach to learning. Hence, its guiding vision is that of a competent future citizen, which is greatly needed in a globally competitive era. Secondly, OBE is an educational process. It is an educational process which means it aims to equipping learners with the knowledge, competence, and orientations needed for success after they have leave or they have left the institution. When we talk of educational process, it means it is based on the principles of science, humanism, democracy, lifelong, and degree of education. This basically means that OBE teaches students to become lifelong learners. Next one, OBE is assessment driven. Take note, class, that assessment needs to be emergent from the learning process. By the way, when we talk of assessment driven, it means a system which is largely focused on content, knowledge, and skills and rarely gets beyond the application in its outcomes. Hence, OBE helps distinguish between teaching and learning. Simplihan natin. It simply means that in OBE, learners are being assessed using the assessment criteria of the outcome. In OBE, assessment is used to determine whether or not a qualification condition, criterion, or skill has been achieved. Next one is, it is directed and focused at achieving certain specified outcomes in terms of individual student learning. Further, OBE is also uh, uh, directed and focused in achieving the specified outcomes. So, before I'll talk about it, let us vividly define outcome first. So when we talk about outcomes, it means key things students should understand and be able to do, or the qualities they should develop. So going back, uh, in OBE, it is directed and focused, meaning it has a clear picture of what is important for students to be able to do. Then organizing the curriculum, instruction, and assessment to make sure this learning ultimately happens. So that's OBE. Now, uh, it's not what we teach, it's what the students learn. This means that everything teachers do must be clearly focused on what they want students to know, understand, and be able to do. In other words, class, teachers should focus on helping students to develop the knowledge, skills, and personalities that will enable them to achieve the intended outcomes. So, to give further emphasis, here is a comparison between OBL and CBL. So let us learn more about outcome-based learning versus content-based learning. So as you can see, in the first column lies the characteristics of content-based learning, and in the second column lies the outcome-based learning or outcome-based education. Okay. In CBL, firstly, let's look at column 1, CBL. In CBL, there are what we call passive students, while in OBE, it has active students. So, passive learners are encountered in CBL, as I mentioned earlier. So, when we talk of passive learning, what do we mean? So, we mean that the learning process requires learners to absorb, assimilate, what else? Consider, and translate information. On the other hand, in OBE, it encourages students or learners to undergo active learning, where there is a conversation and debate. Okay? In a similar manner, in CBL, learners acquire knowledge without making any conscious efforts, while in OBE, there is an active involvement of learners in the differentiated tasks and activities during discussions. Next one, in CBL, it is exam and grade driven, while in OBE, it has continuous assessment. Let's make it simple. CBL only measures the cognitive aspects of learning, while OBE promotes learners' skills, knowledge, attitudes, and values. Next one, in CBL, rote learning is emphasized. What does rote learning mean? So this is the process where memorization technique is involved. For example, traditionally, we were asked to repeat and repeat and repeat and recall the multiplication table. Can you still remember it? Okay. While in OBE, critical thinking is encouraged. What do I mean? So it goes beyond memorization technique. For example, we do not merely memorize, repeat, and recall the multiplication table, but we also apply fun tricks in learning the multiplication table. Okay, so that's critical thinking. Next one is that it is also in CBL, okay, it is content based which means that language is acquired within the context of the content. Its purpose actually is to prepare students to acquire the language while using the context of any subject matter so that learners learn the language by using it within that specific context. While it is true that learners can develop a much wider knowledge with CBL, still, OBE is much better since it has integration of knowledge and it is learning relevant. When we talk of integration and learning relevant, it means we do not only focus on the content, but we go out of it by making connections to real world issues, problems, and contexts. Next is that CBL is teacher centered, while OBL is student-centered. The best definition could possibly be when it is teacher-centered, the classroom is quiet. But when it is student-centered, the classroom is often noisy and busy. How does this happen? Basically, because there is constant interaction where teachers model and students interact with instructor, teacher, lecturer, or okay, the professor, and with one another. To make it simpler, in a teacher-centered learning, the teacher functions as classroom lecturer. Take note. While in a student-centered learning, the role of teacher is more of a coach or a facilitator. Lastly, in CBL, what the teacher hopes to achieve is being emphasized, while in OBL, outcomes are emphasized. This idea is similar to what I mentioned a while back that it's not what we teach, it's what the students learn. Okay, so I hope you were able to grasp the difference, okay, between content-based learning and outcome-based learning or outcome-based education. Now, we proceed to dealing with the paradigm shift in education and training philosophy. Well, change is really inevitable. Same goes in the field of education. You agree? So in the new paradigm, knowledge is actively constructed, discovered, transformed, and extended by learners. That is why from teacher-centered, it turns to a student-centered, wherein the teacher's efforts are aimed at developing learners' competencies and talents. Also, from traditional teaching, it shifted to SCL-based teaching. Okay? This is a good shift in education since learners are given the chance to acquire knowledge on various fields of education and lets them integrate theory and practice and work also collaboratively. By the way, SCL stands for Student-Centered Learning. In contrary, the role of teachers were shifted from being lecturer, so they now function as coaches who guide learners in the acquisition of knowledge. OBE, therefore, as emphasized by James Towers 1996, education that is outcome-based is a learner-centered results-oriented system founded on the belief that all individuals can learn.